Today I am going to teach you about the ecological model of mental health. After studying this module, you shall be able to know what the ecological model of mental health is, learn about the behavioral setting, identify the various principles of ecology and evaluate the pros and cons of this model. You shall also be able to analyze the different aspects of the individual and the environment. Let me begin by giving you an introduction. Ecology is the study of life at home with emphasis on the totality or pattern of relations between organisms and their environment. Living organisms and their non-living environment are inseparably interrelated and interact upon each other. Kurt Lewin in 1951 may be considered to have sown seeds for the ecological model. His concept of life space has been an attractive version of the environment for many psychologists. Life space per se includes all the facts that have existence and excludes those that do not have existence for the individual or group under study. Ecological perspective takes into account the environmental factors. Barker in 1968, a follower of Lewin, initiated a series of studies describe and conceptualize the environment, E as it is called in a small community. Barker said, if no one is to examine the interrelationship of behavior of the individual, let's call it I, and the environment, E, these two must be studied separately first in order to avoid tautological situations. Any unit, that is a biosystem, that includes all the organisms that function together, which is called the biotic community, in a given area interacting with the environment so that a flow of energy leads to clearly defined biotic structures and cycling of materials between the living and the non-living parts is an ecological system, or as we call it, an ecosystem. This ecosystem is the basic functional unit in ecology proposed in 1935 by British ecologist A.G. Tansley. An ecological system or an ecosystem is a set of interacting, independent living, that is the organic or the biotic, and the non-living, that is the inorganic or the abiotic components or subsystems. Let me talk about the ecological model of mental health now. Ecological model comprehensively addresses public health problems such as injury at multiple levels. Now these highlight the interaction and integration of biological, behavioral, environmental and social determinants, as well as the influence of organizations, that is the workplace and schools, other persons, which could be the family, friends and peers, and public policies, all of which together help individuals make healthy choices in their daily lives. A key feature is that it highlights how health and well-being are affected by changes and interactions between all these factors over the course of one's life. There are three dimensions of this model, and these can be identified as: number one, the individual and their behavior; number two, the physical environment; and number three, the social environment. Each of these dimensions can then be analyzed at 5 levels. The 5 levels are as following. Number 1 is the intrapersonal, number 2 is interpersonal, third is organizational, fourth is the community, and fifth is the society. Let us now talk about the characteristics of behavioral settings. There are 7 characteristics of behavioral settings. These settings are: number 1, standing patterns of behavior. Second, standing patterns of behavioral milieu. Number 3, the milieu is circumjacent. It is enclosing and it is encompassing. 4 is the milieu is symptomorphic, that is similar in structure. Then is the behavior milieu parts are cynomorphic. After that, cynomorphs have a specified degree of interdependence. Lastly, cynomorphs have a greater degree of interdependence with parts of other behavioral settings. Now, what exactly are behavioral settings? Behavioral settings are economic behavior units that make up a community. Barger assumed that number of forces within a behavior setting is constant. Therefore, with optimum manning or overmanning, these forces are distributed among more people than is true when the setting is undermanned. In the optimally manned setting, each individual will experience less force, and in the undermanned setting, each individual will experience more force. In the undermanned setting, it would experience more range of directions of the forces acting than in optimally manned setting. Let me talk about the principles of ecology next. The ecological model assumes that the community is an ecosystem that can be characterized and understood through the concepts governing ecosystem. Community psychologist Jim Kelly in 1968 introduced 4 principles of the ecological perspective. Number 1 is the principle of interdependence. The principle of interdependence asserts that the different parts of an ecosystem are interconnected and that changes in any one part of the system will have a major effect that will impact the other parts of the system. The ecological model draws attention to 3 interdependent levels of analysis. Number 1 is the personal or the micro level. Number 2 is the relational or the meso level. And the third and the final is the collective or the macro level. All these levels are interconnected with each other at smaller level nested within the larger levels. Now let me go on to the principle of cycling of resources. This principle focuses on the identification, development and allocation of resources within systems. One clear finding from the experience of deinstitutionalization is that, with a few notable exceptions, resources were not reallocated from state hospitals into community support and housing programs as were needed. The cycling of resources principle also draws attention to potential untapped resource in a system. Traditionally, society has regarded the formal mental health system as the resource. Next, I will talk about the principle of adaptation. The principle of adaptation elaborates that adaptive process of an individual to environment vis-a-vis community. The principle of adaptation suggests that individuals and systems must cope with and adapt to changing conditions in an ecosystem. In the wake of deinstitutionalization, communities have had to adapt to the intersection of people with ongoing mental health problems into their ranks. Community support workers and programs had to cope with inadequate funding and waiting lists for limited community services. Families have had often to become primary care providers, and people with mental health problems have had to contend with stigma, poor housing, poverty, and inadequate support services. The next principle I am going to discuss with you is principle of succession. Succession involves a long-term time perspective and draws attention to the historical context of a problem and the need for planning for a preferred future. Now, this gives rise to changing demands for adaptive capacities in both community and the individual's behavior. Community exists in dynamic equilibrium with its E, that is the environment, and the changes in the E creates forces for changes in the community structure. Now, why is the ecological metaphor important? Community psychologists utilize an ecological metaphor in its emphasis on people in the context of social systems because they believe that mainstream psychology has focused too much on individual psychological processes and has neglected the important role that social systems play in human development. Since mainstream applied psychology has focused on individuals, there are many ways of thinking about individuals. The perspectives could be psychoanalysis, behaviorism, or humanism, and assessing their characteristics. For example, the personality, IQ, and so many other tests of individual differences. Now, in contrast, the study of the social environment is in the infant stages of development. Community and environmental psychologists have been instrumental in beginning to develop ways of conceptualizing and assessing human environments. Community psychologists need to understand the pathogenic or oppressive qualities of human environments, those that stultify growth and create problems in living for people. On the other hand, understanding the salutary qualities of environments can help community psychologists in their work with community members to create environments that promote health, well-being, and competence. Community psychologist Jean-Anne Linné has recently reviewed 3 ways of thinking about and assessing environments. They are 1. Participants' perception of the environment. 2. Setting characteristics that are independent of the behavior of participants. And 3. Transactional analysis of the dynamic relationship between behavior and context. I'll briefly talk about each of these 3 approaches. Let me first talk about perceived environments. Moose and colleagues have emphasized the importance of the social climate or atmosphere of a setting. The key notion with this conceptualization of environments is the emphasis on people perceptions of the environment. Most people can think of settings that they have experienced as oppressive and settings that they have experienced as empowering. Moose has argued that there are 3 broad dimensions of different social settings. Now, these are relationships, personal development, and systems maintenance and change. The relationship dimension is concerned with how supportive or cohesive the setting appears to be. Is the setting experienced as caring or compassionate? The personal development dimension addresses the individual's need for self-determination. Does the setting provide opportunities for autonomy, independence, and personal growth? Systems maintenance and change is concerned with the balance between predictability and flexibility. Does the setting provide clear expectations, yet at the same time demonstrate an openness to change and innovation? Too much predictability can produce boredom and resentment because it may reflect rigid authoritarianism, and resistance to change. On the other hand, too much flexibility can produce confusion due to continuous uncertainty and flux. Moose and colleagues have developed self-report questionnaires tapping these three broad dimensions and specific sub-dimensions to assess classrooms, families, community programs, groups and work settings. Now let me talk about the objective characteristics of environments. This is the second approach to the assessment of environments, which is to examine the characteristics of the settings that are more objective and independent of the behavior of individuals who participate in those settings. Different types of measures, example observational methods, demographic and social indicator data, are used to assess qualities of the environment, such as the physical and architectural dimensions, policies and procedures, and environmental resources. One example of an observational method cited by Linné in 1990 is the passing approach designed by Wolfensberger to assess the extent to which families of people with disabilities reflect the construct of normalization. He defined normalization as the utilization of means which are as culturally normative as possible in order to establish and or to maintain behaviors and characteristics that are as culturally normative as possible. Now, the external observers spend several days observing these settings to come up with ratings on a number of different dimensions, including physical integration of the setting with the community and the promotion of resident autonomy, social integration with the neighborhood, and many more. Now, another way of assessing environments is to examine demographic and social indicator information about the community or the setting. Such information provides an aggregate description of the characteristics of the individuals residing in the community. That is the age, socioeconomic status, ethnic background, and the characteristics of the community, that is the types of housing, crime rates, rates under treatment for different psychosocial problems. The next approaches that I'm going to talk about are the transactional approaches. Linné in 2000 describes transactional approaches as those that include both the behavior of the individuals and the characteristics of the environment. Now, one transactional approach is the concept of a behavior setting which was developed by Barker in 1968. The two main components of a behavior setting are a standing or routine pattern of behavior and the physical and temporal aspects of the environment. Now, there are implicit guidelines of how to behave in a behavior setting. Like, for example, in a classroom science lesson and gym period are different behavior settings, and the behavior of the people in these settings can be better predicted on the basis of the setting than on the characteristics of the people in the setting. Now, I will give you an example of how one can use an objective approach to the assessment of the environments. Objective assessment of school atmosphere. Here, there are many psychologists who use both observational and social indicator or demographic information in a study of 12 inner city secondary schools in London, England. The major goal of the research was to identify characteristics of school atmosphere and to see if these characteristics were related to students, that is the rates of delinquency, behavior problems, academic achievement and attendance over the 3 years that they enrolled in these schools. Some of the measures of school atmosphere were gathered through observational methods. Students had better outcomes in schools that showed a strong academic emphasis. This was indicated by the total amount of teaching time, starting the class on time, assigning homework, planning departmental curriculum, displaying students' work, and frequently using the teacher praise for students. Other qualities of the school that were related to positive outcomes were good care and condition of the school, encouragement of student responsibility and participation, low teacher turnover rates, and the number of experienced teachers in the school. Now, while the researchers demonstrated an association between the school atmosphere and the student outcome, these relationships could be due to other factors, such as the characteristics of the students. Now, to control for this selection factor, the researchers used the method of social indicator and demographic assessment to describe the qualities of the students at the time they entered the school. Students with higher verbal aptitude and who came from higher socio-economic status backgrounds had better outcomes 3 years later than those who were lower on these dimensions. Both the important findings of the study were that the school atmosphere measures predicted outcomes over and above the characteristics of the students at the time they entered these schools. So what we can say is the school atmosphere does make a difference for the students. Let's move on to the intervention principles. There are at least 4 principles under the strategy of intervention in the case of the ecological model. They are: number 1, intervention deals directly with local community condition. In dealing with these, there is a need to tailor interventions to the past requirements of a specific setting. The intervention program stresses the importance of longitudinal assessment of the local setting. Now, assessment here is viewed as an important part of the change process. The other important aspect of the intervention strategy is to anticipate the effects of the intervention on the inhabitants and take efforts to reduce the negative effects and hence the positive ones. And finally, a variety of potential interventions are included. This principle considers alternative bases for the various effects that can be anticipated with a view to reduce the changes brought out by stereotype programs which produce stereotyped solutions. Let's go on to the assessment. There are several drawbacks along with plus points of the ecological model. Let me talk about the drawbacks first. This model places explicit emphasis on values that arise within the setting, with interventions designed to meet local conditions. The ecological metaphor has value in providing a systematic and holistic perspective for the understanding of human experience and behavior, and it has led to the development of different ways of understanding and assessing human environment. This model has tended to focus more on the micro and meso levels and to neglect the macro level structure and interventions. Another limitation of the ecological model is that in their emphasis on circular causality and interdependence, which does not take into account or highlight power differences within the ecosystem. Now, this model also requires a new definition of the criterion for work of the psychologist in the community settings, as well as educational setup involving research in the field of community psychology. And finally, this model conceptualizes community process as a subject to natural evolutionary change. Therefore, it is not necessary to create forces for changes in the community. Let me summarize what I have taught you. Kurt Lewin in 1951 may be considered to have sown the seeds for the ecological model. An ecological system or ecosystem is a set of interacting independent living, which are the organic or biotic, and non-living inorganic or abiotic components or subsystems. The 3 dimensions of this model are individual, physical environment and social environment. Behavior settings are economic behavior units that make up a community. The principles of ecology are principle of interdependence, principle of cycling of resources, principle of adaptation, and the principle of succession. There are at least 4 principles under the strategy of intervention in the case of the ecological model. Along with several positive aspects, there are also several limitations to the ecological model of mental health.